Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. Today is May 18th, which is National No Dirty Dishes Day. We were talking about this earlier, and I got to be honest with you, I have dirty dishes everywhere in my house. But anyways, I am delighted to be able to speak with all of you today. You know, at Kroll, we're always looking to provide thoughtful insight and great value to our clients to help them to defend their organization against any of the latest cyber threats and improve their cyber maturity for sure. My name is Keith Wojcicki. I'm a managing director and global head of threat intelligence for Kroll Cyber Risk and based in DC. I've been here with Kroll for about 5 years, and prior to this, I worked for the U.S. Secret Service, really where I was able to have the opportunity to lead the Secret Service's cyber threat intelligence program. So a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. I wanted to cover just a couple items. One, today's session will be recorded, and two, it will be available after the briefing. We're also using GoToWebinar for the presentation, and you'll find the client on your monitor. Through that client, you'll be able to submit questions at any time, and our presenters will answer questions at the end. So during the briefing, please submit your questions. I'll get them together. We'll talk to them at the end. Anyone that we're not able to, we'll follow up with an email and answer those questions. So today we'll be taking a look at the current trends that our threat intelligence team has been seeing in 2022. Kroll really is in a unique position to deliver end-to-end cybersecurity solutions across several different service lines. You know, Kroll carried out over about 3,200 incident response engagements in 2021, and today we're going to hear more about what we've seen in the first quarter of 2022. So we do have a wealth of experience with over 550 cybersecurity experts on the Kroll team who are working around the globe with companies of many sizes, variety of industries, and we do work with over about 60 cyber insurance carriers. This gives us tremendous visibility to what's going on the front lines. Today we'll be taking a look at the current trends that our threat intelligence team has been seeing in quarter one of 2022. In this session, we're going to cover how we've seen a 54% increase in phishing attacks being used for initial access, as well as a new method of extortion through email compromise. So Lori and George will take you through a couple of case studies as well to show you the reality of these types of attacks. We are very fortunate, and I'm really excited to have two of the leading experts join us today. And one is Lori Iacono, the second is George Glass. Lori is an associate managing director in Kroll. Lori manages the day-to-day operations for the cyber threat intel team, which has many functions throughout Kroll, to include supporting the incident response engagements. Prior to this, Lori managed the Brand and Consumer Protection Program at the National Cyber Forensics Training Alliance, or the NCFTA. That's headquartered in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. George Glass is the head of applied intelligence at Kroll and is responsible for ensuring that the latest threat actor intelligence is applied to a proprietary XDR platform. It's used to power a managed detection and response service to clients around the globe. Before joining Kroll, George had a background working across defense, finance, and e-commerce sectors in the UK. With that, I'm going to turn over to Lori to give us more insight into the threat landscape for 2022. Lori?
Thanks, Keith, for that introduction. So for those of you who might be joining the quarterly call for the first time, I want to give a short background and methodology of this report. So what we do is we gather data that we're looking at and gathering from our incident response cases. So these are actual, cyber incidents or possibly network intrusion cases that we're looking at. We combine this with insights from the managed detection and response side of the house, which George will be speaking to this afternoon. And we overlay that with what our team of threat intel analysts are seeing from open source intelligence reporting, as well as what we're seeing from threat actors themselves on the dark web. And our goal here is to, basically show you what we are seeing threat actors doing in any given quarter. Generally, when we put all this data together, we start to see emerging trends. And our session here is really to put this into a narrative for you. Hopefully looking at these trends, you may be able to identify any gaps or weaknesses in your organization. And then we'll also at the end talk about some solutions for how you can mitigate against some of these emerging threats. This is part of a full written report. The Kroll Q1 report will be published. I believe it's published live on our website today. So if you haven't seen that, go across our social media. Please, talk to your Kroll point of contact, and they'll be sure to share that report with you. Looking at this first slide here, we're looking at basically some statistics from our incident response cases. So this first box here on the left is looking at sectors, the top sectors that we were seeing targeted in our incident response cases during the first quarter. As you can see here, professional services is at the top of that list. Professional services, this is a category that includes things like legal firms, accounting firms, real estate, staffing services, all fall under that umbrella. We're also seeing, frequent threats against technology and telecom, financial services, healthcare, and the manufacturing sector. We did see an uptick against the manufacturing sector in the first quarter, and we'll talk a little bit more about possible reasons for that towards the end of this presentation. Looking at variants here, this middle box, this is looking at the most active ransomware groups that we observed in the first quarter. And Conti and Lockbit 2.0, they continue to be two very active ransomware groups. But we did see some newer ones that were edging up in the first quarter, including Abos Locker, Quantum Locker, and Ragnar Locker is not new, but they were active in the first quarter. And then looking at the third column here, initial access, here we're talking about how actors are getting into systems. And we will, do a little spotlight on this in a section later, looking in more detail. But phishing was the top initial access vector that we observed in our cases. And that goes along with an overall trend that we saw of threat actors targeting email in the first quarter. CVE, or vulnerability exploitation, was another, and then valid accounts, which would be the use of basically compromised credentials to take over an account, were two of the other frequent initial access methods that we were seeing. If we look at the next slide here, we are going to drill into a little bit more detail around email compromise specifically. I mentioned that we definitely saw threat actors targeting email in the first quarter, and we have several case studies related to that. So looking at the next slide here, we have graph breakdown basically of the threat incident types, and these were specifically from our observations of our incident response cases. And you can see that email compromise, as I said, there was an increase since the last quarter. It also tied with ransomware for the #1 spot. This was the first time since the beginning of 2021 that email compromise had actually tied or was at that #1 spot. Predominantly, it has been ransomware for almost the past 2 to 3 years, has been in that #1 spot. We did see an ebb when it came to ransomware cases in the first quarter. That doesn't mean that ransomware isn't a very active threat. It's just that we saw a slight ebb there, and we'll talk more later about some possible or potential reasons for that. I did want to point out too, web compromise, you can see a slight uptick for that we've seen over the last 3 quarters, and much of that we're attributing to high-profile CVEs that are out there, such as Log4j, also Spring4Shell, which was first published in the first quarter. There were also some vulnerabilities in WordPress sites that were publicized in the first quarter, and we definitely saw some threat actors exploiting those for things like SQL injections. Looking at the next slide here, we're going to go into specifically a case study on email compromise. As I said before, threat actors are definitely targeting email. And one trend that we've been seeing, I would say, really within the past 6 months or so, has been actors using email compromise as a means to financial extortion. So, typically what that might look like is they may get into an account with stolen credentials, then, exfiltrate some data from the email account, and then try to extort the victim into paying their ransom demand. This is a flow from a specific case that we had in the first quarter. And in this case, this actually started with a phishing email. So we have them targeting email, and they're getting in through a phishing email. In this particular case, they were targeting the IT staff of a company. So they were going after the IT staff. Unfortunately, they ended up hooking a victim. That person ended up putting in credentials to a fake site, and when they gathered those credentials, they were actually admin credentials for the organization. So when the actors logged back in using those credentials, they actually had admin privileges, and they used that to pivot to take over other accounts on the system. They were particularly taking over a lot of C-level and IT staff accounts when they were doing this particular incident. One of the interesting things that we observed here, a lot of times when actors take access or get access into a system, they're not just staying in email, they're pivoting out, they're going into the network, they're going a little deeper to find data. But in this case, they remained within the email. They started exfiltrating data, doing searches for things like SharePoint links, things like OneDrive links, large attachments, and they started basically stealing down all of that data, taking those shared documents. And after some time in the system, they'd actually stolen, hundreds of gigabytes worth of data. And at that point, they basically ransomed the company. They put a note on one of the email accounts that they were threatening to publish this data, and the only way to stop this attack or stop the data from being leaked was to pay the actors. This is typically a scheme that we would associate with ransomware groups. And in this respect, they did follow some other norms of ransomware groups with their tactics of trying to get their ransom. They were calling personal cell phones, they were texting personal cell phones. In some cases, these actors even took over personal social media accounts that were associated with these users. So that we can see they were really stopping. Nothing was really stopping them from trying to get their demands. And it does mirror the efforts of these ransomware groups, but it's possible that less sophisticated actors are seeing the success of ransomware groups, the financial success that some of them are having, and they're seeing that an attack like this is a lot easier than carrying out a full-blown ransomware attack. So as I said, this is something we've seen a few cases like this in the past 6 months. So it is something that we want all of our clients and the public to be aware of. This is just one case study related to email from our incident response cases. And I'm going to hand it over to George now to talk through what we're seeing with email compromise and from our managed detection and response side of the house.
Thank you very much, Laurie. So we have in front of you here the statistics from the MDR side of the organization. The incident severity ranges from P4 being sort of informational all the way through to P1, which is confirmed malware on multiple endpoints. The trend here is upwards. Now, that may not be particularly surprising with new customers coming on board and the like. I think the most interesting trend is the uptick in P2 and P1 incidents that we investigated and remediated between Q4 and Q1. We had what we were referring to internally as Malware March, where we saw a huge increase in the amount of ICE-ID, Quackbot, Async Rat, and especially Emotet attacks across multiple industry sectors. In this particular case, and on the next slide, I'd like to take you through a particular async rat infection, which I think is slightly atypical, but may be linked to certain activity clusters that are directly targeting the transportation industry with async rat specifically. Now, this incident actually starts in January, where a third party totally unrelated to the victim organization was compromised. That third party dealt specifically with travel to Asia, and that organization had all of their email contacts dumped and stolen. Now, when it comes to the victim, a phishing email was sent masquerading as that third party, that travel organization, to the personal inbox of an employee at the victim organization. I think this is a really good learning exercise. The fact that the employee could access their personal email address at work meant that they were a victim to this particular phishing attack. And in this case, the email lure was extremely convincing, and it contained a HTML attachment. Upon clicking the attachment, a double redirect took place, to a file hosted on OneDrive. And we see threat actors doing this an awful lot. OneDrive, Google Drive, TransferWise, places like that are very commonly allowed domains on corporate firewalls, and so they are usually used to host malware such as this. In this case, there's an ISO file hosted there, which contains, once opened on the victim's computer, a VB script. Now, the use of the ISO file we're seeing more and more again, as well as .lnk files, to obfuscate the mark of the web on the actual payload that the threat actor wants to execute on the victim's machine. The mark of the web is something that Microsoft uses to discern whether a particular file has been downloaded. ISOs, zips, and LNK files can allow them to bypass that. Once the VB script was executed, it immediately downloaded async rat, and async rat again immediately began reconnaissance and data collection via the use of PowerShell scripts. This is where the endpoint detection response portion kicked in. Detections were fired for connections to malicious IPs, in this case because we are tracking async rat, and PowerShell invocation via VBS. So in that instance, the host was immediately quarantined and instant response engaged, meaning that we could quickly remediate the situation. One of the things I want to draw attention to in this particular instance is the layers of obfuscation that the threat actors have gone through in order to lead to the victim downloading and executing a file. As you can see, there's 3 things that the victim has to click on, but all of which are designed to defeat inline security measures in some way. So inline security for emails, and in some instances endpoint detection as well. So we're seeing that threat actors are certainly trying to find new ways of obfuscating their payloads. I think this is a really good example of that. Back over to you, Laurie. Thank you.
Thanks, George, for that example. And it's a good transition to our next section here. We're going to talk specifically about initial access, or how are threat actors getting into systems. So looking at the next slide, we'll kind of see a breakdown of initial access for the last few quarters. Definitely, in the last two case studies illustrated, we see that 60% of cases we saw related to phishing. The last 2 case studies we went over definitely illustrate that, both starting with the phishing attack as a first step. So, phishing though is predominantly the #1 initial access method that we're seeing. If you joined the last quarterly call in February, we talked about at the end of 2021, we were seeing a lot of activity around vulnerability exploitation. And that number dropped a little bit in the first quarter. That doesn't mean it's not a threat. That doesn't mean it's not something that everyone should be paying attention to. Just means that we saw a little less of it. One thing I want to highlight though, even though we saw less in numbers around vulnerability exploitation, the cases we did see that started with a CVE or some kind of zero-day exploitation, they were more destructive than we had seen at the end of 2021. So whereas in the 4th quarter of 2021, we were seeing Log4j lead to things like the installation of a crypto miner, in the 1st quarter of this year, we were seeing more and more of groups, the ransomware groups, adopting tactics like this to get footholds into systems and then ultimately launch ransomware. Proxy shell was another one that we were seeing the ransomware groups use, which we'll talk about in the next example. And also with that phishing, I did want to mention too, we talked, a lot of that rise in phishing maybe because of some very active campaigns that we were seeing with Emotet and Iced ID, which we're going to talk about next. So this case study here, this is an interesting one because in this case, the actor used a vulnerability to get access to the network, but then once they had access, they wanted to kind of magnify the malicious links that they were sending out. So they did that by sending out an internal phishing campaign. And this was a tactic that we would call, email threat hijacking, where they were using these legacy email threads between two employees communicating with each other. In this particular instance, and they were replying to one of these legacy threads with a zip file. It claimed to be an invoice of some sort. And they actually, in the email, like, not only did you have to download the zip file, but then to extract the files, you actually had to enter, I think it was a 6-digit passcode. Unfortunately, at this particular organization, there were, numerous individuals that did this, and once those files were open, it actually downloaded Iced ID onto their systems. And in this case, there wasn't that, endpoint detection firing that George talked about in the last example, but instead, once Iced ID was on the systems, this later led to the deployment of Quantum Locker ransomware and that particular network being encrypted. We talked about internal phishing campaigns. In this case, they were being used to amplify the attack. One of the infrastructures that we typically relate to internal phishing campaigns is Emotet. So I'm going to have George in the next section talk a little bit more about the continued return of Emotet malware.
Thank you very much, Laurie. Yep, I love to talk about Emotet, so I'll try not to bore you too much with my ramblings. So what have we seen from Emotet from Q1? Well, the resurgence of Emotet continues. We are tracking Emotet very closely on both Epoch 4 and 5. We've seen continuous development and experimentation from both of the epochs, so both the botnets. We are seeing continued spam campaigns, both volume and duration are increasing significantly, which we certainly picked up in March. That was very evident. And a number of these campaigns are using, as we've been talking about, business email compromise and email thread hijacking. Some of the notable changes from Q1, we noticed IP encoding as octal or hexadecimal. So to the human eye, that looks pretty horrible to look at. It doesn't appear to be an IP address. Obviously, to a machine, it really makes no difference. Again, this is a very easy way for Emotet authors to bypass inline protection and defense. Again, we also saw continued use of both normal .zip archives and password protected .zip archives to bypass the mark of the web. Emotet remains to be one of the most sought after initial access channels. Its resurgence, I think, is a really great sort of watermark for its success. We can see that clearly the demand is there. And for the Emotet actors, I think it's fair to say that the business is going quite well. We know that there's a significant overlap with the Conti operators using Emotet. We know that they're replacing TripBot with the Emotet loader, not only because of how successful it can be as a botnet, but because of its modular nature as well. It's used as a stealer, self-spreading modules, email stealing, and also one of the big changes that we saw around December of 2021 and going into Q1 is the fact that it's capable of being used as a continuous loader. And indeed, we have seen it being used to immediately install Cobalt Strike beacons ready for Conti operators to move to ransomware operations. So pretty significant threat. I think it's fair to say that any Emotet infection should be considered a precursor to ransomware. And I'd like to take the opportunity on the next slide to take you through a case study that we dealt with in March. So as I said, business email compromise remains to be one of the most common ways that we're seeing Emotet delivered. That's part of how it's designed and built. In this case, it's a reply chain attack between a third party and the victim organization. The employee received an email with a .zip attached. Again, this is to bypass mark of the web. In this particular case, and at this time, Emotet was still using XL 4.0 macros. and detection started when Excel started to launch PowerShell. The contacted domain downloaded basically a dynamic link library renamed as a .ocx file, and at this time, because endpoint detection response was installed on the employee's endpoint, the next generation antivirus portion of that product stopped the installation of the Emotet payload, which is fantastic. At the same time, detections were fired for XL contacting malicious IPs from our Emotet C2 tracking, and indeed failed regserv32 invocation via PowerShell as well. Now, just like the last example I gave, I'd like to sort of present this particular case with a learning opportunity. And the next part of this investigation, I think, is particularly pertinent to any organization. And that's the fact that the victim realized that something hadn't worked. Their Excel file that they were expecting to open and see the remittance advice or the pay slip didn't appear on their machine. So they shared that file internally to see if one of their colleagues could open it, leading to that host becoming potentially affected and obviously had to be quarantined. So again, in these cases, work has to stop while those hosts are quarantined and instant response is engaged. So still time lost, but thankfully nothing particularly malicious came out of it. So hopefully some more learning opportunities there. Back to you, Laurie. Thank you.
Thanks, George. So next we're going to drill into what we saw with ransomware in the first quarter of this year. And as we go into the next slide, I mentioned earlier that we saw what we're calling an ebb in ransomware activity during the first quarter. Next slide, we can go to the graph. So we were actually down 20% for ransomware from Q4 to Q1, and down about 30% from Q3 2021 to the first quarter of this year. So what are some reasons or potential, rationale for that downturn that we were seeing? And one thing I want to mention before I get into that actually is a lot of that downturn was in January and February, and we started to see more activity in March of this year, which seems to be what we're continuing to seeing to this day. But going into January and February of this year, we were coming off of a 2021 where there have been some significant law enforcement disruptions to some of these ransomware groups. So, high profile ransomware as a service operations like Revil had been disrupted. Their site was taken down, as well as some of the notorious affiliates associated with, high profile attacks like Kaseya had been arrested. I think that was in November of 2021. This scrutiny was even prompting some of the other ransomware gangs to voluntarily say they were shutting down operations, such as Black Matter. So it could have been that because of this renewed scrutiny and pressure, we were seeing a drop off from some of these ransomware groups. And you can see here on the chart that where we saw kind of the prominent drop off were with some of these larger ransomware as a service operations like Conti and Lockbit. But some of the smaller and newer ransomware as a service operations, such as Avos Locker, Quantum Locker, and Black Cat, we were seeing an uptick in activity related to them. So going into the next slide here, I do want to talk specifically about some sector analysis that we did. So looking at our top 5 sectors, one of the ones where we saw the biggest increase from Q4 to Q1 was in the manufacturing sector. And looking at those cases that we observed in our incident response cases that were impacting the manufacturing sector, we saw that those were predominantly all ransomware cases. So it definitely seemed like the ransomware groups were targeting the manufacturing sector in the first quarter. So a couple reasons why we might be seeing that kind of activity or targeting of the manufacturing sector. One of those reasons could be the view by some of the threat actors that that's a softer sector or a softer target, that they're more likely to get a ransom demand from them, thinking if they, are able to halt production or business critical things like assembly lines in a manufacturing plant, that those groups may be very likely to pay the ransom to get that back up and running. It could also be that ransomware groups are targeting them to use for some kind of a supply chain attack. So, in this scenario, this would be the manufacturing would be one of their targets, but they'd actually be, potentially using that target to leverage them into a larger fish, perhaps a vendor or some kind of supplier that's larger on the food chain, so to speak, that they're looking to target. So that could be some of the targeting that we're seeing around the manufacturing sector. If we go into the next slide here, we're coming up to the point where we're starting to summarize what we were seeing in the Q1 landscape. As we talked about, really we saw the targeting of email in the first quarter. So, as phishing for initial access, as well as, general email compromise as a threat type, using email as a means to financially extort victims as well. When it comes to, phishing and things like this, we're seeing phishing used as an attack vector in two different ways by these threat actors. First of all, they're using it as the initial access method to get into the system. But then second, as one of the case studies I talked about that led to Quantum Locker ransomware, they actually got in through a vulnerability, but then they used that phishing to basically spread those malicious links further into the network. So they're, basically targeting end users as pawns to help them initiate and amplify attacks once they're in a system. And then, we talked, the first case study we talked through was this email leading to extortion. And this is definitely something novel that we have been observing more of in the past 6 months. So I'm going to hand it over to George now, and he's going to talk about some mitigation strategies that organizations can take to try to detect and hopefully prevent this kind of activity before it happens.
Thank you, Laurie. So I imagine that many of you would have seen a number of these actions before, but I want to hopefully provide some advice that maybe you have not considered, and just reiterate for the sort of maybe more popular ones what specifically can be done and why they are so effective. So first and foremost, enabling multi-factor authentication. That is guidance that is given by government organizations. I'm pretty sure most organizations would be considering this in some way. And it is extremely impactful for basically denying credentials to threat actors. If they can capture credentials, but they can't effectively use them because there's MFA in place, then they are far less valuable to a threat actor. One thing in particular that I'd like to bring to your attention is we are recommending the use of one-time passcodes or number matching. We have seen threat actors use notification spamming, where they will continually ask for access on an MFA device, and so the victim's phone or multi-factor application will continually provide them with notifications until they just give up and hit accept. Surprisingly simple, but actually incredibly effective. So there's a particular MFA version that would be one-time passcode or number matching. The case studies that I covered today for Async Rat and Emotet both used EDR in some way, and in both cases were used to very effectively remediate the issues. Not just for the detection and the remediation side, but also for the ease of remediation as well. Most organizations nowadays are remote in some way with a distributed workforce. Enabling remote access to those devices with an EDR tool is absolutely paramount to getting back up and running as quickly as possible. So absolutely consider deploying EDR to as many endpoints as you possibly can. Specifically for email, reviewing email policy is extremely important. Trusted senders, third-party DKIM, DMARC, SPF records, all of those things are absolutely really fantastic things to be doing. Also, maybe consider quarantining attachments from unknown or untrusted senders. That will certainly help hinder the sort of the cold call mal spam that we see. But what if a threat actor can bypass those controls, or they use business email compromise or internal reply chain attacks? Well, consider for the endpoint blocking users from opening non-standard files. So there's a list on screen now. I think in many instances, a typical user may not need to open these types of files. So consider blocking them with group policy settings. Archiving old emails. This is a particular, again, denial strategy for a threat actor that has been able to infect an endpoint. If they only have a certain number of months of emails to work from in their reply chain attacks or information to steal from, you're denying the year's worth of information that they may be getting if you do not choose to do this. And again, utilizing password managers as well. Another denial strategy. In this case, it's specifically to mitigate a threat actor targeting passwords stored in the browser. Many passwords stored in the browser are not encrypted or not encrypted very well, and so they can be easily stolen. And most of the commodity malware, especially all of the variants that we've talked about today, will automatically attempt to steal those credentials. Managing privileged access and disabling legacy protocols. This is a general cyber hygiene thing. And again, it's designed to inhibit a threat actor once they have successfully exploited an endpoint, to limit their lateral movement across an environment. This goes for anyone, but especially those with significant privileges that may have their credentials stolen. And lastly, a couple of things that I touched on in my case studies is security culture training to identify and properly report the suspicious activity that users may be seeing. I think this is particularly important with the change in tactics and novel techniques that threat actors are using. A lot of security training may not cover those in depth, or they may be fairly out of date by the time a user is taking those trainings. So incorporating the newer attacks, the third-party compromise, the reply chain style attacks, as well as the novel use of certain file extensions, I think is a really good thing to incorporate into that training. And with that, I think that's it for me. I will hand back over to Laurie. Thank you very much.
Thanks, George. So just a reminder that what we went over today, this is a portion of what we saw from the first quarter, and we do have a larger written report. I believe it is in the chat for the webinar, so everyone should be able to have a copy from that who is on the call.
Awesome, thank you guys, really appreciate it. And we have a few minutes now to take some of the questions. As a quick reminder, type your questions in now for George and Laurie. We'll have a couple minutes. We have a couple come in during the session, so I'll start with a couple of those. One question is, can you provide insight on how the escalation to physical warfare in the Ukraine prompted significant concerns about the possibility of retaliatory cyber attacks? Laurie, do you mind tackling that one?
Yeah, I can take that one. So certainly, talking about the first quarter of 2021 and not mentioning Ukraine and Russia may seem like an oversight. But you know what? I definitely, when all of that happened, escalating to physical warfare, there were a lot of concerns that we were going to see a very large uptick in cyber activity in relation to that. Amongst our cyber casework, we did not observe an uptick in relation to that geopolitical activity. So that's why we're not specifically reporting on it here. And as of now, what we're seeing has really been kind of reflecting what we're seeing in open source reporting. It's not that there isn't cyber activity related to this conflict, it's that most of it for now has been predominantly confined to that region and to more specific targets than just hitting all organizations. All of that being said, in February of this year, when all of this started happening, and CISA and other federal organizations and international organizations were saying, we're coming out and putting out recommendations for people to follow to make sure that their cyber shields were up. That's definitely something that we recommend all of our clients adhere to and follow. We have something at Kroll we call the 10 essential controls. And basically it's 10 things like having MFA employed, having backups in place, having an incident response plan, those sorts of things. We recommend everyone have those in place because they can help not just defeat the adversaries that we're all expecting, but any general kind of cyber attacker that may be out there could potentially be waylaid by these kind of by adhering to these kind of recommendations.
Fantastic. Excuse me. Thank you, Lori. Appreciate that. And then one more question we have is, what can we do to mitigate phishing attacks?
So I'll start with the phishing attacks. Essentially with phishing, I kind of think about, we talked about all the case studies today. They had kind of like multi-stage attacks. So there were multiple different ways that they were using to get into the systems. And I think of the multi-layered security approach that we need to combat phishing. So first would be, the biggest thing is we don't want the phishing emails to get into the inbox. That would be the first step. So things like email and spam filtering are definitely going, to help get that email out of the inbox. And then the next thing is, if it makes its way into a user's inbox, that's where education comes into play. So educating, making sure that your users are aware of the latest trends in phishing email, and not just educating, but also assessing it. So regular phishing assessments where you can see whether or not that education that you're doing is actually working across your employee base. And then the last thing that I would say there would be, even if it kind of goes through those two steps, it gets into the inbox, somebody clicks on it, if it's then open and some kind of malware is deployed, hopefully there's something on the system like an endpoint detection and response that is picked up and stopped before it progresses to a full-blown cyber incident.
George, any follow-up with the phishing mitigation?
Yeah, I think it's important to say as well. I echo everything Laurie just said. But if a particular piece of malware gets onto a machine, you need an instant response plan in place to be able to deal with that effectively. And so you should plan for the worst to happen just in case.
Yeah, you're spot on. I mean, preparation is so paramount today. The status quo are the ones that are getting attacked. So definitely want to make sure you're prepared and have an instant response plan in place. So sadly, we've run out of time today. A really big thank you to everyone that has taken the time to tune in. We really hope you found this session informative. As Laurie stated, we published our Q1 2022 Threat Landscape Report on the Kroll website. So if you want to go into more detail of today's trends that we've outlined, then please have a read of the report. You can also find it, as Laurie stated, in the handout section in GoToWebinar. So when you leave the briefing, you'll be directed to a short survey. If you could spare a few moments, we'd greatly appreciate it. If you could tell us your thoughts on the session, this really helps us prepare for the future sessions. Once again, thank you for joining us today. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we hope to see you again at one of our future briefings. Laurie, George, really appreciate your expertise on this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.